So it's sometime last week and I'm sat there scrolling through one of my favourite financial news websites. It's called Barron's. And I stumble across a headline that catches my eye. When investing for the long term still isn't long enough. I mean, that is a provocative title that kind of flies in the face of the common wisdom that's repeated parrot fashion by journalists and financial influencers all over the world. What precedes in this article, which is of course linked below for you, is a comparison between the economies of today and that of the 1970s, which is often referred to as a lost decade for investors due to poor market returns and staggering levels of inflation. This article is basically arguing that the culmination of unprecedented events that we see today in our economy are going to lead to another lost decade for investors, basically a period of time where the markets stay flat or just slowly decline. So is this comparison to the 70s fair? Do we face another lost decade? I must admit, when comparing the two decades, the similarities are pretty striking. Let's take a look.
I want to talk to you tonight from my heart.
I want to apologise.
Our standard of living will be affected by rising inflation.
Everything's more expensive.
The barrel price has gone sky high.
They keep saying there's no shortage.
It's the back half of the year, and as a Swedish band looks set to dominate the charts with the release of new music,
Swedish supergroup is back.
people up and down the country queue up at petrol stations worried about fuel shortages. For those of you who are born in the 80s or later, you'll think I'm describing late last year, when one of Sweden's greatest ever exports returned from a 40-year hiatus. You might say I'm an ABBA fan. And motorists exhibited no restraint rushing to petrol stations to fill up in a game of winner takes it all. And if the events of last year don't ring a bell, well, you could always pick up the phone and ask, does your mother know? Because those who are a little older will likely remember a similar set of circumstances in the 70s. ABBA dominance and fuel shortages leading to a gimme 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 at the petrol stations.
There's your diesel for you.
Now with a little bit of creative license and a few jumps back and forward across the Atlantic, the similarities don't stop there. And neither do the ABBA puns, unfortunately. We have a political leader in Nixon who was embroiled in scandal. More recently, we got Boris, and instead of Watergate, it's Partygate. As one long-standing conflict ends, others threaten to destabilise the world economy. Oil prices soar, and there's wild currency speculation from the dollar in the 70s and crypto now. With the 70s, we know how the story ends. Disastrous monetary policy led to runaway inflation, which caused investors to have a pretty bad time for the whole decade.
Well, that was a load of shit.
If you invested $100 in the S&P 500 at the beginning of 1973 and reinvested all your dividends up to 1980, you would have seen a return of 59.58% on your funds, or 6% per year, which doesn't sound too bad on paper, but because of the levels of inflation, actually what you would have ended up with is minus 14% in real terms.
Load of shit.
So it's easy to see why people draw comparisons with the 70s, and are quick to say that the next 10 years will be a
lost decade.
The lost decade.
The lost decade.
But this isn't the first time the finance world has claimed that we're heading back to the 70s again. On screen is a headline from The Economist. When do you think it was printed? 2004. It's human nature to look to the past for answers. In fact, every time there is above normal inflation, it seems that people whip out the flares and start preparing to go back to the 70s. But that's kind of a pointless exercise. To understand why, we need to understand a little bit about knowing me and knowing you. Contrast effect describes the cognitive bias that happens when two things are judged in comparison to one another, instead of being assessed individually. The perception of one thing is impacted by its comparison to the other. A simple visual example I can use to explain this is something called the Adelson-Checker shadow illusion. Take a look at the image on screen. Tell me which box is darker, A or B. Most people will say that A is darker, but most people are wrong. The problem is our brain processes the whole image, sees the checkerboard pattern, and tells us that in comparison to A, then B must be this. What if I told you they are the exact same colour? Don't believe me? Check this out. Magic. That's a fun little optical illusion that I can use to demonstrate my point. When we look for comparisons between things, it's easy to draw, similarities and come to conclusions. Because this happened then, this should happen now. But there's a problem with this. While there are many similarities to the 70s, there are also some huge differences. Back then, America was far more dependent on oil than they are now. So a rise in oil prices from $2 to $32, or a 16 times increase, was devastating.
So you've no source of heating at all? You've no heaters or anything?
No.
There was also two events that happened in this time period that will just never happen again. The removal of the dollar from the gold standard, which meant the American government could just increase the supply of dollars without the need to back that up with reserves of gold. Also, there was a shift in the way society worked. In the 70s, the amount of women entering the workforce continued to rise significantly. And for the first time in 1974, women could borrow money without a man countersigning for them. That was a much needed step forwards towards the end goal of equality between men and women, but what it also meant was a lot more spending power entering into American homes. That disposable income found its way into goods and services, which increased demand, but supply couldn't keep up with that. Too many dollars chasing too few goods. The too few goods point was exacerbated by the fact that in the 70s, the global supply chain wasn't really that well established because China hadn't entered the market yet and wasn't able to suck up all that extra demand. This table shows how world trade boomed in the 80s following China's opening up. So prior to this, America had what it had, and increases in purchasing power would often just result in rises in demand and thus prices. China's cheap production and cheap goods solved this issue for a while in the 80s. So what I'm getting at is markets are dynamic, and the inputs and the influences that affect the economy at that period of time are unique to that period of time. The 70s is the only time that will ever be like the 70s. But that doesn't mean that we're not in store for another lost decade. If you Google the term lost decade at the minute, you get a load of Wall Street professionals saying that rising interest rates are going to cause an overall decline in markets, and as a result, passive index fund investing is dead and you need an active strategy in order to navigate the market and make any money. Barry Bannister is one such professional calling for a lost decade, and as we know, it wouldn't be the first one. Coming back to that original article, the writer describes how investors who purchased in 1968 didn't see a return on that money until 1982, or more recently, another lost decade was between 2000 and 2014. So the idea of this is all pretty scary, right? But as is so often the case, there's sanity and reassurance can be found in the comment section. If we scroll down, the top comment reads, "Incredible that an article like this can be written and miss the major point. Markets went 14 years before they provided a positive return, but for those who dollar cost averaged at regular intervals during those years, their portfolio returns were firmly in the plus column long before 1982. When professionals discuss these lost decades, it's like they assume that all investors do is invest at point A and exit at point B, and that in the middle is nothing but a barren wasteland of zero returns, bad trousers, and some of the greatest pop disco songs ever made. ABBA was a great band, Voulez-Vous is a straight banger, I won't hear another word said about it. In fact, I'll give 100 quid to the first person who can name every single ABBA song that I've referenced during this video in order. They have to be in order, just submit a comment below. On screen is a breakdown of the monthly returns of the S&P 500 between 1973 and 1980. And here is another one, from 2000 to 2014. They're hardly flat, are they? By dollar cost averaging throughout these lost decades, you actually improve returns significantly. The novel Investor showed how by taking the lost decade that is the noughties, where it is widely quoted that there is absolutely no return on offer for investors in the S&P, a consistent approach turned 0% to 24% return. Now, I know that's not world beating, but it is a positive return. And what followed after that was a decade of absolutely stellar returns for investors. So anyone who consistently bought through that period positioned themselves perfectly for the next decade. It's human nature to look to the past in order to predict future outcomes. Without it, the human race would have probably wiped itself out on a single bush of poisonous berries. We remembered that Fernando died after eating one of them, so we steered clear in the future. It's also the media's nature to predict the end of the world every 5 minutes and show you stats to support this. The lost decade is an incredible headline, isn't it? And plays into our fears as investors that we're doing something wrong. But as the most important investing disclaimer says, past performance is not an indicator of future results. And that works both ways. Just because a stock's been rising doesn't mean it will continue to do so. And just because the economy today mirrors that of a decade gone by doesn't mean that we're going to get the same outcome. But I'll leave you with a quote from Shelby Davis. So if we do find ourselves in another lost decade, you can remind yourself at this point. You make most of your money in a bear market. You just don't realize it at the time. Guess that's what ABBA meant when they said, though it's hurting me, now it's history. The winner takes it.